So in today's webinar, we're going to talk about custom data sets. I really like custom data sets. Custom data sets are a great way to extend the system. So the system comes with a fair number of fields: demographic information, name information, personal contact information, all sorts of information that we already have fields for. Custom data sets lets you extend what is already in the system and track things that we didn't even think to, or might be specific to your organizational needs. So additional volunteer information, student information if you work with students. We can even process fee for service payments through custom data sets. So we have a lot of things we can do with custom data sets. So let's start with actually how you create one. And then we're going to run through all the various components of it, how to use them, and do a little bit of reporting on them. So we're going to start off by going to Configuration, Custom Data Sets. Now I do make a couple assumptions in this webinar. The first being that you're familiar with what contact types are, but I'll just give you a brief definition of what contact type. Contact types represent a category of contacts who have something important, usually broad, in common: donor, household, member, volunteer. So these are some contact types. But if you need more information on contact types, I do have tutorials, or the NPE 101 webinar will give more on that. So here we have it: configuration, custom data sets. So how do we create a custom data set? Well, the first thing is we create the data set itself. So we do that by clicking on the Add button over here. And so what is a data set? A data set is effectively a container for the fields that will hold the data. So when you're making your data set, let's go ahead and click the Add button, you're going to get to give it a name. And try to consider this name as with that thought of it's a container. So this isn't the field itself. The fields will be within this container. So this should be a name that represents all the information you plan to have organized in this data set. So they should all have something in common. For example, additional volunteer information, as we see back here, is one. And so that would have other things that you might track about volunteers. So if you're working with children, maybe you've had to have a Department of Justice background check, tuberculosis screening. Things like that are things you might find in an additional volunteer information section. Or it might have information such as education levels of your volunteers if you're doing tutoring. Things like that. Although you might actually track that with skill levels. So always double check that the system doesn't already have something for that. So in this case, we're going to track, what should we track? We will track student information. So in this example, we're an organization that works with students. And a lot of organizations do, whether you're teaching the classes or they're students from school, various things like that. So in this example, we want to track student information. So let's call our data set student info. Okay. And then we get to choose, well, what kind of data set is this? How are we organizing our data and our fields? General is your most basic data set. So when you see the demographics section in a contacts record, that would be an example of a general data set if that were a data set. Basic fields, drop downs, we're not keeping any historical data. If you change the value, you're not worried about what the old value was. Those are general data sets. Things like highest education level, maybe some skills or languages, things of that nature. Payment is, so payment and transactional are similar data sets in that, unlike general, we can keep historical information. We're not just filling out a field, we're filling out basically kind of like a journal entry, that represents a snapshot in time. So we'll be tracking the date we made this entry and then the fields. So every time we make an entry, we'll be re-adding the fields, but we don't lose the old data. This is good for keeping track of teachers who have taught classes maybe, or for the payment, or grades over time, or the schools that a child has attended over time. Things like that, things that wouldn't normally be tracked in events, mind you, but that you might want to track, things that might change over time, like a student's grades. The first semester, of first grade, they got this letter grade, or this is their GPA. Next year, you want to know what their their GPA is, but you don't want to lose the previous year. So that's the kind of thing you keep track. When you look at donations or memberships, donation is probably the better example, and you see the individual entries for a donation, that would be an example of a transactional data set, very complicated one. Although you might actually think of it better as a payment details data set. And so what payment details is the same concept as transactional. You're keeping entries over time of something, but you're actually keeping track of financial entries. So the payment details will actually tie into the financials module. So if you use the financial module for tracking deposits to the bank or syncing with QuickBooks or any of those things, if you make a payment details data set, you'll be able to track things like fee for service. So if your organization provides some sort of service and gets paid for it, you can use a payment detail data set and it will end up in your financial history. So kind of like a donation, when you enter the donation, there's an entry for it, and a payment shows up in financials, same idea. So these are very similar. It's just if you're tracking money, use payment. If you're just tracking information, transactional data set. So let's start with a general. Student information, info, is a general data set. We're going to track basic student information. So what might we track? Well, what are the kind of things you might track for a student? Their areas of interest. What areas of learning does the student you work with have? Maybe they're big into sciences. Maybe they're big into the arts or the maths, or languages. So those might be the kind of fields you might track. So we'll use those as our examples in a minute. But in the description field, we can kind of say, what this data set's going to be tracking, and then whether or not this is for individuals or organizations. If we are tracking like foundation information, so we are tracking, foundation specific information about an organization. This would be for organizations only. Since this is student info, it's only appropriate for individuals. If we're tracking maybe school information, so we're tracking information about schools themselves. Is it a charter school? Is it a public school? Is it a private school? Is it a secular versus religious private school? Things like that. Then we'd connect it to organization as opposed to individual. Okay, so we have our data set. Student info of the general type for individuals. Save and close. All right, we've created our container. Here it is, student info. And now we get to configure it. Well, the first thing we do is we choose what, if any, contact type we will be attaching this data set to. So you may have noticed with all of the predefined contact types, donor, member, student, volunteer, volunteer, so on and so forth, there's data associated with them. Well, if we want to think about them as data sets, that data is the data set associated with the contact type. It only appears for a contact with that contact type. So if I was to attach this data set to the contact type donor, only people with the contact type donor will have this data set. If I do not attach it to a contact type, it will show on that first add edit page of a contact's details. So that contact info page or the organization info page for organizations. That first page you get to on add edit down at the bottom. So if you're simply extending the individual or the organization contact records, you don't need a contact type. But I generally recommend caution here. If you make any of these fields required, which we will do later, and they shouldn't be required, so especially for the payment data set, you can sometimes block yourself. So you'll be attempting to save a record and you will not be able to save it due to required fields that do not apply to a general contact. So be careful whenever you attach a data set without a contact type. Do not make any field required, and we'll talk about required fields in a little bit. Okay, so here's our contact type. What do we want? Well, student information should be attached to the student's contact type. If the contact type doesn't exist and you need to create it, you will have the option to do so right here. As with anything in Nonprofit Easy, I always recommend be certain you need to create a new contact type. So, but in some ways, custom data sets will make it so you don't need to make a lot of them because you can track it in the data set. Okay, so we've connected our student info data set to the contact type students. If this was school information, we would attach it to school. If we were extending the donor tab to try and have some extra donor information, I'm not quite sure what you'd want to track in that case. You'd attach it to donor. We at Nonprofit Easy actually use our own database, as you may be aware or may not, and all of our clients are members, and we've extended the membership contact type to include things like service area. What services, what area are you trying to benefit as an organization? What's your Nonprofit Easy URL for easy access by our support staff? Did you get any migration specials? Things like that. Trainings. We keep track of trainings in a transactional data set, for example. So we've actually extended the membership contact type quite extensively. So if you're an organization that works with a lot of organizations or a lot of individuals, and you want to keep more information about membership, you might connect a data set to membership. Okay, moving on. So we've attached it to students. Now we get to pick the fields. And this is where the real magic happens. This is where we pick what information we want to keep. So what might we track about a student? Well, we might track what school they attend. So we have two ways we could do that one, for example. Well, three ways, really. So we could say school. What is their current school? So we might actually call it something more appropriately as current school. Well, we could do a text field. And this is basically, we just write it in. Advantage here, no pre-configuration, and we can write whatever we want. Disadvantage, inconsistency. So I might put Sacred Heart, Sacred Heart as the school. My fellow staff member might put Sacred Heart Middle School. Was it a high school? Anyway, while another coworker may put Sacred Heart Private School. So you get inconsistencies. And so if I want to see all the students who attend, Sacred Heart, or Casa Grande in Petaluma, I won't be able to just do a drop down. I will actually have to say, okay, name contains sacred, because someone, or Sacred Heart, or has the word heart in it. So it becomes a little harder to report on it. But data entry is easier because you can put whatever. As an alternative, you may actually decide to do drop down. So what drop down is a drop down. So you would configure every school you work with in a drop down so that when staff is entering in the school, they just pick from a list. Disadvantage, pre-configuration. I personally don't think that's a big disadvantage. You only have to do it once. Advantage, you get consistency in reporting. Staff only has to select from a drop-down. They don't have to worry about spelling. It might even be faster. If I want to know who attended Casa Grande, I just select Casa Grande, say that 5 times fast, and I'm good to go. So I like drop-downs for that purpose. There's a third option, contact. This is a fun data set field in that it represents a contact in Nonprofit Easy. So as long as the school exists as an organizational record or individual, but not in this case, you can link to it from the contacts record by selecting it from a drop-down, much like the other fields in Nonprofit Easy where you type in and you get a drop-down, you can select or you can add. You'll be able to do that with the contact. When I keep track of trainings I do, for example, one of the things we keep track is who's the trainer. So I will select my own contact record in that case. Or if somebody else had done it, I'd select them. So those are your 3 options in this case. So let's go with drop-down. We could also do radio button, which is basically the same as a drop-down, but it takes up more space. Check marks would if you had multiple entries. So all 3 of these work basically the same. We create our entries. So Casa Grande, add. Sacred Heart, add. And so on and so forth. Let's add one more. Rancho Cotati. It's actually a high school, but we ignore that. And so on and so forth. And you can rearrange these if you want to. Helps when actually. There we go. You can rearrange them, you can delete them, you can edit them. So that's the kind of in a nutshell some of those. So we're going to talk more about a couple others. So, but while I'm here, let's talk a little bit about the options. I'm a little out of order on my outline, I admit. Whenever you make a field, you have two options that you can do alongside of it. You can make it required. So if someone goes to the schools tab or the student tab in a student's record, they cannot save the page without saving the current school. This has the advantage of it makes it so that staff has to put information. It has a disadvantage of it makes it so staff have to put information. So if they have the information, they're good to go. If they don't, but they have other information, they may be stuck. So be careful with making it required. This once again goes back to if it's on the individual contact page, that first page without a contact type, it can get in your way sometimes. Okay. Next option is display on contact details. So in the contact record, and we'll see this later, everything has a section giving details, membership details, volunteer details, so on and so forth. A contact type that you create will end up with its own details section. Pretty cool. And you will choose what information is shown. So we can show up to 5 fields on that summary page. Beyond that, you'll have to go a little bit deeper, like anything. So you get to choose what you show. So just be certain that you're picking the most pertinent information, and you don't have to show everything. So you can show nothing, you can show up to 5. Generally speaking, you want to at least show something. If you're doing a transactional set, you're probably going to want to at least have the date showing. But you probably want more information than that. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this one. And let's talk about some of the other field options. All right, so we just did a drop-down. And I've covered a couple of the other ones. So what other field options do we have? What else can we keep track of? Well, we can do text. We talked about that. Multi-line text. So if someone wrote a little, why do you want to be a member kind of thing, or why should we give you this grant or this scholarship, or if you do grants or scholarships, you might keep track of those application form information in a multi-line text. So that's things like little essays. Number is for integer numbers, so whole numbers, no decimal points. There's a small bug right there right now that if you put a decimal, it'll crash. We're going to get that fixed. But this is if you want to keep track of the grade they're in. So we could say grade level. Ooh, level. And we could do that as a number if we wanted to. Although it's going to be thrown off by the fact that K is K, but you could do K as 0 or something like that if you wanted to. I'd probably, though, do grade level as a drop-down. But, so that's number. Yes, no is basically a simplified radio button. That's yes or no. This is good if you ever want to keep track of something, of like a preference. Has this person given us permission to contact them for our general e-news bulletin? Well, okay, ignoring the fact that's somewhat handled by newsletter categories. If you want to make it clear whether or not the information here is a affirmative, a negative, or currently undefined, yes, no is handy for that. Because if someone's marked yes, we know a staff marked yes. If they've marked no, we know they marked no. And if it's blank, it means they haven't entered any information. Sometimes there's a certain level of uncertainty with things like checkboxes. So things like gave us permission as a checkbox can sometimes be uncertain, because if it's unchecked, does that mean that we haven't gotten to it, or that they told us no? So yes, no is good for that. I'm going to skim through the other ones. So phone number, email, URL, pretty straightforward, just fields for tracking additional information like that. Date and time, these are handy for when did things happen, or if you want to track the exact time, date and time. We talked about drop-down, radio, checkbox. Currency is especially going to be handy in your payment transaction data sets, because that's for the amount field. Contact, we talked about that as a contact in the system. Picture, exactly what you think it is, lets us put a picture in. Don't see that used too often, so use it as you want. Sometimes we'll have people, I've seen it used for artists, and examples of work, 3 examples of work, and they had 3 picture fields, something like that. All right, now, what is the matrix? Well, no one can be told what the matrix is. Okay, bad joke. But matrix is basically a contact, is a field within a field in a way. Matrix is a way to make basically miniature spreadsheets, kind of. So matrix is a way to create one field for tracking multiple pieces of information that are all similar. So for example, if I wanted to track the actual grades of a student in a semester, I could create a field called grades, what have you, with row options. So for example, my first option could be the subject. So math, spelling, English, literature, science, what have you, are my row options. So I could go maths. I know I say it the British way, don't mind me. So I might say maths and science, which always needs to be said dramatically, or religion if it's a religious school, whatever, you know. So these are your rows. Next is your columns. Well, what are we tracking about math, about science? What are we tracking about our subjects? So actually, this might be better said as subjects. So one of the things we might be tracking is the letter grade, in which case you'll make a drop down. You know, A, B, C, D, E, F. Wait, no E. You know what you get what I'm saying. So that might be one of our columns, is the letter grade. You know, A, B, so on and so forth. Well, that's one of them. Another one thing might be notes. Maybe we want to track any notes about that semester in math or science. So we could do a multi-line text for notes about the subject. Bobby did really well, but he's struggling in biology, the biological aspects of the sciences, or something, you know, whatever. He's good at math. He's good at the conceptual aspects of math, but his speed on testing is holding him back. You know, something like that. And you know, whatever you might track per grade. So you might also track the actual percentage. So you might give them the letter grade, the percentage, and note field per grade. So matrix is a really handy way of basically building column and row header fields. So let's go ahead and we'll save this, keep this in place so you can see it. So save and close. A really powerful combination is a transactional data set with matrix. So with that combo, you could, for example, keep track of the letter grades for every subject for every semester. So you effectively make what's called a three-dimensional array, for those of you who like geeky math stuff. So it's basically it's a grid in space and time. Anyway, I'm getting esoteric again. So that's matrix. So is there any questions about field types and names? Field types, names, configuration. So at this point, we've covered them all. Okay. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to type them up or unmute and let me know. So in this case, let's get back to our example. We've got a little esoteric there. So student info is our custom data set with the attached to the contact type students. And we've connected a number of fields to this custom data set, tracking things like their current school, their current grades, and grade, well, we called it grade level, but it should actually be grades, and stuff like that. Let me fix that while I'm here. So, you know, we can have any number of fields in a custom data set. All right, so how do we make use of this? You know, we've built this nice little custom data set. How do we actually make use of it? So let's mosey on over to a contacts record and let's see it in action. So we're going to go back to contacts individuals, since students are individuals, not organizations, and we're going to define somebody as a student and look at their record. So first off, let's say that Adam B. Ross is a student. Okay, so we're going to just click on his name. We're going to go on in, and here's those sections I was talking about, and This isn't what we made. This is something pre-existing. This is a different data set, but this is an example of a data set that has been assigned, not one that I created. So first things first, he's got no contact type, so we need to make him a student. So we're going to edit the record. And we're going to give him the contact type students, which gives us this tab for students. Do note that if it's a custom data set, we can save it right now without adding data. If it's a custom contact type, we can save it right now without data. If it's any of the predefined ones like member, donor, etc., we would have to save data to the contact type or to a data set before it would save. So students, we go to the Students tab, and we have tick. Screen shares always slow me down. Okay, I was getting a little nervous there. So here we have the custom data set that we created. Ignore this one. This is one I did from a previous one that's also attached to students. So here's our data set that we created. We have our dropdown for current school, and we have our matrix. So like I said, we have rows and columns. We also did that over here. This is this is a similar one. This one uses a text field, just called testing for whatever information, and it has the individual semesters with the subjects as columns. So this is another way. This is a way to do a matrix in a way that simulates a transactional data set. I wouldn't normally do it this way. Somebody did it this way. I wouldn't normally. But so here we have, let's go back to our example, one that we created today. Well, what did they get in math? Well, they got an A and strong in concepts, weak in arithmetic. I don't know, whatever you call it when you're actually trying to do it in your head. Let's see if I can spell it. Arithmetic. All right, I love spell check. And then science, could be, and so on and so forth. So that's a transactional data set in play. And then once we have our information in, we can just save. Normally it'd be quicker than this. My computer gets slow during screen shares. And so that's how you use a custom data set. Nothing too fancy. If this had been a transactional data set, then I would have filled out my fields, hit end save, and oh, actually this is a transactional. So that was a general. Here we have a transactional. So let's actually use this one. Why not? So we'll see our first field is testing, just stuff, and we select, from our drop downs. In this case, we did it as a check boxes, and then we hit save. And what it'll do is it will create an entry right here. Normally you'd have a date field also attached to this, but this person who set this up did not do so. So this way we can show you both. And so now here's my entry. If I want to make another entry, I could say stuff 2, and the grades are different. And then when I save, I'll get a new entry underneath it. And that's why you'd normally want a date stamp on it so that you can differentiate them more easily. But you don't have to, as you see. You don't have to put a date stamp on it. But I usually would recommend a date stamp. And then if I want to edit an entry, I can edit it. And it will put it up here. I can also delete one. So transactional is good for historical data. General is good for data that you don't care about the past on. That can update, and the old state of that information no longer matters. So state preservation, no state preservation. Okay, so now that we've saved this, how does this look on the record? So let's go to View Contact, and we can see. So now that he has all the appropriate fields. Now down here under student metrics, for example, we have the various information. And the student info is not appearing, so I'm going to actually check my layout because I may have actually turned it off. So by the way, this is a fun thing for changing how and what you see and where you see it. So you can actually move things around. A little extra on the webinar there. And I'm going to go back. So configure layout is where I was because student info had been unchecked. So I was right in here. And now, here is student info. So all the fields I checked as display will be shown here. This is really handy for transactionals because it'll show a little bit of the history. If I had actually wanted to edit any given item, I could edit and delete from here too. I can also preview so I can see the entire data set if I wanted to. So if there's any data set entries missing because they couldn't be displayed, I can see them and go a little bit deeper and click on the preview button and it will show me them. So I didn't actually save any other data, so there's nothing to show. All right, so that, in a nutshell, is contact types, custom data sets. If we had created a payment data set, it would be much like a transactional, but we just have a whole lot of required fields with payment information. And you could then also, and then the first step, you would have also been able to attach it to an accountant class, but I didn't cover that today. All right, so now we have these fields, we're using them, we're filling in information, they're all configured, everything is happy. How do we report on it? Well, every custom field you create will be both a criteria and a column. So let's mosey on over to reporting and let's take a peek at a custom report. So we're going to make a custom report. For those of you who haven't played with them, here's a crash course in them. We're going to add a new custom report. We're going to give our report a name. So let's call this custom, let's call this student report. And now we have columns. So we have all the basic columns, but now under custom fields, we have our custom columns. So it'll say the custom dataset's name, and then is that a caret? Bracket, closing bracket, and which field you created. So if I wanted to look at current school, I could say student info, current school is, and here's that drop down I made. So I want to see everybody who goes to Casa Grande. Or I could go something more interesting. I could say I want to see all my students with who have a history grade of A+. Or you could do something a bit more general and be, I want to see everybody whose current school is not empty. So if you have a current school, this will pull you up. So let's do this one, so I can get the maximum results for the next screen. Then we go to next step. And as with any custom report, we will pick our report view. When you're working with custom data sets particularly, you're probably using either the individual contact report or the organization. Not guaranteed, but these are the most commonly used one and the more predictable ones, especially when you're working with a transactional data sets. So what's going to happen is I'm going to pick individual, and this would normally give me one line per person, but I'm working with transactional data sets. So I'm going to uncheck some of the fields I don't care about. I'll just keep contact name. And here are all my custom fields organized by data set, allowing me to pick them as columns. So since student metrics was a transactional data set, what's going to happen when I check this? Normally I get one line per person. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to give me one line per person per entry in the data set. So I don't normally recommend mixing too many data sets together. So I wouldn't try and mix two transactionals together. It could do weird things. Probably give you like 6 lines per person when you should only have 3, or something strange like that. So if you're using a transactional data set in your reporting, probably only do 1 per report. If you mix them, you should be fine. It might just look weird. So student metrics And let's even do student info that we played with earlier. So, and then save and preview. Now, I believe metrics report oddly. Oh, or they break. I think I overwhelmed it. I'll look into that later. Well, it appears there's a bug in my demo system, which is not surprising because my data gets all messed up. But that should have shown us the see if I can really show you it, the fields. Okay, so in this example, I'm not gonna do the what's it called, the transactional stuff. Let's just go with the basic fields, the general, and save and preview. Okay, so it gives me only one line per person since I didn't do the transactional, and it tells me all their information. So I would get, for every column that I'd have, column row combo, I would have in my matrix, I'm going to get a column for in my report because it's being normalized, and the one-time field will have its own. So here's all my custom dataset fields in my report. I can export this, generate mailing list, all that fun stuff. And yeah, that's custom datasets in a nutshell. Any questions?